He currently serves as a contributor to the WND, or the World Net Daily, an education writer for Freedom Project Media, a foreign correspondent for the New American Magazine. I wonder if they're going to be sending him to Israel soon. A contributor to the Law Enforcement Intelligence Brief, and more. He has also written for numerous newspapers and magazines, such as the Gainesville Sun, Liberty Magazine, the Diplomat Magazine, Crisis Magazine, Swiss News Magazine, Sunshine State News, Campus Reform, Alcoa County Today, and many, many more. His work has been featured at Drudge, Breitbart, Fox News, and many other outlets, and his writings have been published in major newspapers across America. Ladies and gentlemen, let me welcome you. Is that right? Let me introduce you, and let's welcome Alex Newman.
Hey guys, thank you very much. It's an honor to be here. Really appreciate it. Before we start, I got a little personal story. Some of you guys probably have people like this in your family. You know, every election comes around and they just vote for all Republicans, or all Democrats, whatever. So that's like my grandpa. Every election comes and he just votes all Republican. He doesn't bother researching the issues or the candidates. It's Republican, Republican, Republican. And then 2020 comes along and we find out he voted for Joe Biden. Pretty crazy. Emergency family meeting, what's going on here? And we didn't have to talk long until we realized that this never would have happened if Grandpa was still alive. He lived in Chicago, voted 20 times. No. The reality is they are stealing elections, but they're not going to have to steal elections within a generation if we don't deal with the problem that we're facing with the so-called education system. So I want to start with a couple of scriptures. The Bible has a lot to say about education. Believe it or not, God has a very strong opinion on this issue. Our mission as Christians, the Great Commission, is to disciple the nations. But somehow we've concluded that that doesn't apply to our own children. We're going to send a missionary to Haiti, but we're going to send our children to a godless indoctrination camp where they're going to learn gender theory and climate change. So Jesus puts it very clearly in the Gospels. In Matthew and in Luke, he's quoted saying, "Whoever is not with me is against me." In other words, there's only two sides in this battle. And you're on one or you're on the other. If you don't know which side you're on, talk to me later. You're almost certainly on the wrong side. So this is a really serious issue. And this doesn't apply just to individuals. It applies to systems and institutions. Now, Jesus also is quoted in Luke as saying that students are not greater than their teacher. But the student who is fully trained will become like the teacher. And then we wonder why our kids graduate and don't know what bathroom to go in, and they got purple hair and they want to smoke crack, and what happened? Okay. Well, I can share with you what happened, but first here's some of the results. This is the polling data. I'm a millennial, always very embarrassing to admit because people assume you're an idiot for obvious reasons. But this poll of millennials, scientific poll, found that 70% of millennials are going to vote for socialism going forward. Okay? 70% of my generation, that's what I mean, they're not going to have to steal elections in the future. They've already got it. Cuba, here we come. Right? 70%. And it's going to get worse if this continues. Now, this is even more terrible. For the first time in all of American history, we have a generation where only a minority identifies as Christians. Among millennials, only 49% identified as Christians in this scientific poll. And if you talk to those 49%, you'll find out very quickly they don't know the Lord, they don't know the scripture, they're Christian because mom and dad took them to church or something. So this is a catastrophe. Now, even in the 90s, we had 90+% of Americans identifying as Christians. So something incredible is happening. And you don't have to be a rocket scientist to figure it out. In fact, tyrants have been doing this for at least 100 years. Oh, is it too far, too close? Oh, is that better? All right, perfect, thank you. Adolf Hitler, of course, was a leading socialist. A national socialist, that's what the Nazi party actually means, although the kids wouldn't know if they went to government school. And he was wrong about pretty much everything, being a socialist, but he was right about one thing. This came up at the Nuremberg trials. He said, "He alone who owns the youth gains the future." That's why he became the first leader in world history to criminalize homeschooling. No, parents cannot educate their children at home. The Reich will handle that for you, thank you very much. And then it wasn't enough to just be indoctrinated in their government brainwash camp. Then they had to go join the Hitler Jugend and do more Nazi salutes and all the rest of it. Why was he so upset? You know, people think it was his Panzer divisions and his Luftwaffe, his plan for the 1,000-year Reich. No, it was to brainwash the children of Germany, and he did it very, very effectively. Now, he wanted to drive a wedge between parents and their children. He wanted the state to take over the duties that we have for thousands of years of human history associated with the family, with parents. And now this same ideology from the pit of hell is becoming dominant in our country. And I'll show you just a handful of examples. MSLSD.
We have never invested as much in public education as we should have, because we've always had kind of a private notion of children. Your kid is yours and totally your responsibility. We haven't had a very collective notion of these are our children. So part of it is we have to break through our kind of private idea that kids belong to their parents or kids belong to their families, and recognize that kids belong to whole communities. Once it's everybody's responsibility and not just the households, then we start making better investments.
Sorry, but no, kids don't belong to whole communities. Kids belong to God, and it's our job as parents to raise them and to disciple them. Okay, now this is actually the official policy of the U.S. government. In the final year of the Obama regime, the Department of Health and Human Services and the Department of Education put out a new policy where they said parents could be equal partners with the regime in the raising and the upbringing of their children. But as you read this policy document, you'll find out real quick they don't mean equal partners at all. You'll be the junior partner, you'll do what you're told, or we have an escalating list of interventions that we would deploy against you and your family. Starting with mandatory parenting classes, ending with, we'll just remove your children from you, and we'll put them in a foster home. Now, Arne Duncan, the Secretary of Miseducation for 7 years under Barack Obama, thought the government should operate boarding schools.
There's certain kids we should have 24/7 to really create a safe environment and give them a chance. I think all of our schools should be community centers. Our schools should be open 12, 13, 14 hours a day with a wide variety of after school.
Say it with a German accent and you'll see where this is going, right? Now, Hillary Clinton, it takes a village to raise your children. And if you read the book, it doesn't take a village in the sense that we would recognize, but it takes a bunch of government bureaucrats to do it for you. Now, this is still the reigning ideology of our government. I'm going to show you the current Secretary of Miseducation in Senate testimony.
Fairly quick answers here because I want to get the Secretary to Sarah. Do you think parents should be in charge of their child's education as the primary stakeholder?
I believe parents are important stakeholders, but I also believe educators have a role in determining educational programming.
Yeah, let's be clear here. I'm not a stakeholder in the education of my children. Okay, my wife and I are in charge of the education of our children, and this is not a debatable issue. Okay, we're not going to give one single inch. He followed up with a Twitter post. Teachers know what's best for their kids because they are with them every day, right? We must trust teachers. Forget parents. They're not with them every day. Maybe they text a little bit and play with the smartphone while they're having dinner. Maybe, if you come from a good family. The teachers, they're the ones that we should trust, right? Here's current White House resident.
Look, we always talk about these children. They're not someone else's children. They're our children.
No, they're not your children, Joe Biden. Stop sniffing the kids, please. They're not your kids, right? Followed it up, right? He clearly put some thought into this.
Rebecca put a teacher's creed into words when she said, there's no such thing as someone else's child. No such thing as someone else's child. Our nation's children are all our children.
Again, no, they are absolutely not. Stay away from my kids, or we will have a big problem.
I grew up understanding the children of the community are the children of the community.
Okay. I mean, it's repulsive, it's disgusting, it's outrageous, but the implications of this are deadly serious. They think your children are their children, and they are behaving accordingly. So without getting into the details, they do have a plan. It's not quite like Adolf Hitler's 1,000-year Reich, although the differences are not all that extreme. Basically, they call it a New World Order. They've been bragging about it for some time publicly. Here's George H.W. Bush.
We have before us the opportunity to forge for ourselves and for future generations a new world order, a world where the rule of law, not the law of the jungle, governs the conduct of nations. When we are successful,
And we will be.
we have a real chance at this new world order, an order in which a credible United Nations can use its peacekeeping role to fulfill the promise and vision of the UN's founder.
So a lot to unpack there, but a world where the rule of law governs nations. He's talking about global law. We're a credible United Abominations, which is kind of like an oxymoron, right? Credible UN, really? is going to use its peacekeeping role. They're talking about their military forces, their peacekeeping troops, famous around the world for raping women and children, killing civilians, to bring about this new world order. And they're going to implement the vision of the UN's founders, which if you know anything about the UN's founders, that should send a shiver down your spine. You had Joseph Stalin on one side, we sent Alger Hiss, and then later we had to prosecute him because he was a spy for Joseph Stalin. So, not a good idea.
After 1989, President Bush said, and it's a phrase that I often use myself, that we needed a new world order.
The affirmative task we have now is to actually create a new world order.
All right, so they all agree we need a new world order. Total bipartisan agreement, okay? And if you really want to understand this, there's a very simple formula. Take what God teaches in the Bible, flip it exactly upside down. That's what they want on every issue, every time, even if they don't dare come out of the closet yet and say it openly. And they will tell you what the primary mechanism is to bring this horrific idea to pass. It is the indoctrination of your children. And they say it in their own documents. Okay. 1992, George H.W. New World Order Bush, who we just saw, signed Agenda 21. It was the UN's agenda for the 21st century. Like the Soviets had a 5-year plan, a 10-year plan, 100-year plan. The United of All Nations does too. Agenda 21 is their agenda for the 21st century. If you watch CNN, you were told it was a conspiracy theory. It's not. Here's Bush.
We signed a climate convention on the importance of economic instruments and free markets were included in this mammoth Agenda 21 document.
Oh, it's not a conspiracy theory, huh? Here's the leader of the Communist Party in Congress.
The Earth Summit Environmental Leadership Act, as this is known, presents us with an opportunity to follow up on the important work of the Earth Summit to develop its blueprint, Agenda 21, for global environmental action. Congress 353 outlines a comprehensive national strategy for sustainable development in accordance with the principles of Agenda 21.
Notice how the swamp always agrees on the important stuff, right? They'll sucker us when they go out on the campaign trail. No, 43% tax. No, 41% tax. This is a real hardcore debate. But New World Order, Agenda 21, brainwashing your kids, endless wars, we all agree all the time. Now, if you're not familiar with Agenda 21, they summarized it very nicely. This is from the UN. They said it's an array of actions intended to be implemented by every person on the planet. They said it will require a profound reorientation unlike anything the world has ever experienced. Pretty dramatic changes they're talking about here. Did anybody vote on this? Did you guys vote on this? No? Yeah, I didn't either. Interesting. So how are they going to get it done? They're going to brainwash your kids. That's what they say. Go read Agenda 21. Go to chapter 36. Education is indispensable. In other words, it is essential. It is mandatory. This will not happen unless we brainwash your kids and change people's attitudes. So-called education is indispensable to this agenda from hell. They said it's got to give kids the right attitudes, values, and behaviors that will be consistent with sustainable development. It's got to include spirituality, and it's got to be embedded in every single discipline. This is right from the text of Agenda 21 that was agreed to by every government in the world, including ours. You'd think that'd be a front page news story, but no, probably didn't hear much about it. Now they brag that brainwashing your kids is how they're going to get this done. Here's a video I pulled from the UN Education Agency's website.
We achieve sustainable development that protects our planet and builds a more inclusive, equal, and peaceful world without education. We can't. Sustainable development begins with education. Put global education first.
So this isn't Alex Newman telling you that it's all about education. They said this whole thing begins with education. And it's not just any education, it's got to be global education. You heard him say that. We'll come back to this several times. Now they have an Agenda 21 book for children. I have a copy in my office. It's an abomination. And so here's one of the pages. You have some Hindu deities, I guess, sitting up in the clouds, and they're very distressed because these storks are delivering all these babies. And on the next page, adjacent to this, it says, the earth groans every time it registers another birth. Remember the formula I gave you? Whatever God teaches, flip it upside down. What did God say? What was his very first command to mankind? Be fruitful and multiply. So what do they teach the kids? Oh, Mother Earth is groaning when you have pesky kids. Think about the carbon footprint. Goodness. This is outrageous. And yet this is what the United of All Nations is teaching our children all across the United States and all over the world. They have Agenda 2030, they call it the Master Plan for Humanity.
For all our differences and diversity, the world can agree on one thing. Education is at the heart of a sustainable future for us all.
Oh yeah, it is, right? We can all agree on that. Now, if you read this document, it's not that big. By 2030, all of the learners, so all your kids, even if you're homeschooling, whatever, they all need to be so brainwashed, they won't just submit to this ideology from hell. They will actually promote it, is what the text of the 2030 agenda says. By the way, adopted by every government in the world. Pope was there to give his marching orders, is how Fox News reported it. Every government in the world, 2015, adopted this thing. They go on to say that all the kids need to be brainwashed in the UN's understanding of human rights, which is exactly the opposite of the American, the Christian understanding of human rights, right? In our system, God gave us rights. God said, thou shalt not murder, as Pastor Earl teaches, so that means what? You have a right to life. God teaches thou shalt not steal, so you have what? A right to property. God teaches the government must punish evil, therefore the government has to help you protect your right to property, has to punish murderers, right? In the UN system, the UN and these international agreements give you your alleged rights, your privileges, that can be revoked at any time under any pretext. Article 29 of the UN Declaration of Human Rights says you can never use these contrary to the purposes and principles of the UN. It's a total inversion of human rights, but all your kids need to learn it. They need to learn gender equality, which in the UN lexicon means radical feminism, smash the patriarchy, get the women out of the home, get the children in the brainwash camps. They gotta learn global citizenship. I don't even have to explain that one, right? We are, of course, citizens of heaven, first and foremost. I feel pretty blessed that I was born here in the United States, got to be a citizen of America. I have no interest at all in being a global citizen. Okay, and that's the world I was raised in. I grew up in 8 countries on 4 continents. I mean, that's where I came out of, this whole globalist brainwashing. I have no interest in that, but all of your children, according to the 2030 agenda, need to believe that. Now, they did say on UNESCO's website that more highly educated people who have higher incomes consume more resources than poorly educated people who have lower incomes. In this case, more education increases the threat to sustainability. So we don't want smart kids, right? They might go out and solve problems and make money and have a decent standard of living and make life more comfortable for people on this planet. We don't want that. They have a 2030 agenda board game. It's really cute. You have to get the question right to move to the next box. So what is the best way to fight poverty? And if you said biblical principles, private property rights, free markets, you'd be wrong. Okay, you gotta do what Fidel Castro did in Cuba. You gotta do what Robert Mugabe did in Zimbabwe. You gotta do what Pol Pot did in Cambodia. You gotta share the wealth produced in the world, which means steal the wealth produced in the world and redistribute it to our cronies. That's right from the text of the UN's board game. Now, this whole issue of attitude changing, we're gonna touch on this and we're gonna come back to it at the end. But this is actually what the schools in the United States have been doing for decades. My late friend Charlotte Iserby, she was appointed by Ronald Reagan as senior advisor on education. And she went there and figured out they were actually merging our educational system with the Soviet system. So this is a bad idea. Leaked the documents, it didn't last long. But here's what she said they're doing.
You think the purpose of education is reading, writing, and arithmetic? The purpose of education is to change the thoughts, actions, and feelings of students.
So that's what they're doing. Now, they've been doing this for a long time. In 1966, they introduced this all across America. The UN says it needs to be done on every child in the world. It's called values clarification. If you went to school after 1966, you probably experienced some version of this. I remember like it was yesterday when they did this to me in 8th grade. They said, all right, class, you're on a ship. The ship is sailing along, and whoops, now you're sinking. And so you all pile off into the life rafts, and whoops, 11 of you got into the raft, and it's only got a carrying capacity of 10. You got a doctor, a lawyer, an Indian chief, an engineer, a nurse, a teacher. Who are you going to murder to make sure that everybody can survive? And we all know the correct answer. Obviously the lawyer. That was only a joke, okay? But really, what do we need the lawyer for? No. So, you know, if these kids were thinking clearly, they'd say, wait a minute, mom and dad said don't murder, pastor said don't murder. In fact, I think God said don't murder. How about let's not murder anybody? I'll volunteer, swim alongside the raft for the first couple hours. When I get too tired, we'll change out, we'll put the lawyer in, right? But no. They're supposed to say, well, I wonder which one will have more value. Let's do the diversity thing. Is this one disabled? Does this one have darker skin? Okay, this one gets to stay. So they're sitting there thinking about how do we murder? Who do we murder? The only solution is to murder. And what happens in their brain? In an instant, you have just discredited their parents, their pastor, and the Bible. In an instant, you've shattered their worldview. What do mom and dad know? Where's the Bible know? Obviously, they never thought of this situation. They must be dumb. Can't trust them on anything. Clearly, I am much smarter, and I came to this conclusion all on my own. Okay? Obviously, morality and ethics depend on the situation. It's not always wrong to murder. There might be a time and a place where it's necessary to murder. And so these people brag. They say they can undo everything parents tried to instill in their children in over 15 years. They can undo it in 15 minutes. And they're right. Unless your child is extraordinarily well prepared to confront these kinds of subversive exercises, they will fall victim. I fell victim to it. My thought was, man, my parents and pastor are doofuses. They must have never considered this. How could they have not thought about this? What? I can't trust them on anything. Okay? Because they weren't prepared. So they were very proud of this stuff. George H.W. Bush, we saw him earlier, he hired this lady here. Back before anybody heard of a Common Core, they were plotting national education standards. And the Bush regime hired this lady here, Dr. Shirley McCoon, to start working on it. She was put on staff at the Department of Education. And Bush convened a governor's summit. So all 50 of the nation's governors came and listened to her rant. Here's what she said.
Fix up these schools and taking care of them. Rather than the issue of understanding that what we're into is a total restructuring of the society.
A total restructuring of our society. Did anybody vote for this? No, not here either, huh? So here's the mechanism they're going to use. Listen.
The other function of schools, which sounds paradoxical and yet in a sense is really not, is the fact that we have to prepare students not for today's society, but for a society that's 20, 30, 40, 50 years down the road. And so we have to anticipate what the future is, and then move back.
These are tarot cards and a crystal ball for that.
What it is we need to do today. That's called anticipatory socialization, or the social change function of school.
Social change function of schools? How many parents do you think know there's a social change function to the school? Not many. Okay. By the way, where do you think this lady's getting these ideas from? She tells you. She wrote a whole book about it. She claims to be communicating with ascended masters, spiritual entities that are giving her secret insight into the coming new age. You can read the book. It's on Amazon. The Light Shall Set You Free. Whoa. Not Jesus. The light. Obviously, if you read your Bible, these are demons. In other words, they're teaching doctrines of demons to your children. Okay. Now, they have a new and improved form of this madness. They call it social emotional learning. And so they're actually throwing academics out the window. They're not even pretending to care anymore about whether the kids can read, write, or do math. They actually prefer that they don't. So now it's all about these new competencies: empathy, compassion. And you're all thinking, I want my child to be empathetic. Sure, I want my child to be empathetic, right? But they mean something very different. When they say empathy, they mean approves of abortion on demand, approves of open borders, approves of homosexual marriage. That's empathy. That's compassion. They have to agree with our crazy political, economic, and theological ideas. That's what they themselves are saying, right? And so the main organization pushing this is called CASEL, the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning. And right on their website, they'll tell you that the purpose of this is to nurture justice-oriented global citizens. Okay? Right on their website, they say it. Now, I went to the history tab on their website. I did the first critical investigation of this SEL some years ago, and right there in plain English, they tell you what's going on. They said CASEL and the term social and emotional learning emerged from a meeting in 1994 at the Fetzer Institute. Anybody heard of the Fetzer Institute?
No.
It's founded by a New Age occultist weirdo disciple of Alice Bailey, another guy who was talking to ascended masters. And he dedicated his fortune to furthering this crazy ideology from the pit of hell. Now, they're very, very aggressive about pushing spirituality into the schools. And a lot of Christians think, yeah, it's about time we had some spirituality in the schools. They just don't understand that this is spirituality straight from the pit of hell. Okay? I want to show you some videos. The main lady behind this, her name is Professor Linda Lantieri. She's not far from here at Columbia University's Teachers College, the most important education school in the world. And here she is talking about this craziness. Listen very carefully to where she says she's getting her ideas from.
I'd like to offer some guiding agreements that hopefully we can all agree to in this next hour and a half that we're spending, and they come from one of my teachers, who, by the way, showed up at my council table, always does, I hate to say she's passed to another dimension because I have regular communication with her.
Where's she getting her ideas from? From her invisible friend. She says, I hate to say she's dead because I communicate with her regularly. She's just passed to a different dimension. What does your Bible say about necromancy? It's an abomination, thank you. And it's not even dead people. This lunatic thinks she's talking to a dead person. She's talking to demons from the pit of hell. Okay. Here's some videos from the Fetzer Institute about Miss Linda.
Courses like this are rooted in social and emotional learning, or SEL for short, a style of teaching that was pioneered by Linda Lantieri.
I did not imagine that I would be living to see some SEL in 92% of the nation's schools.
It's a lot more than that now, okay? It's ubiquitous. Even private Christian schools. Sprinkle a few Bible verses on top and they'll call it a Christian SEL. There is no Christian SEL, okay?
I knew that if we didn't add the spiritual dimension to this work, we were going to leave kids with not all they needed to know. And the Fetzer Institute is really poised right now to step up in supporting this movement.
Fetzer understands that a basic science to establish the natural spirituality of the child presented a blueprint for building a new system of education. The people of Fetzer walk the walk.
All right, so we need a new system of education that's going to infuse this spirituality, which is exactly what the United Nations called for on Agenda 21, if you remember, chapter 36, right? So the UN actually has an agency that is putting SEL in government brainwash camps all over the world. It's called UNESCO MGIP. It stands for UNESCO Mahatma Gandhi Institute of Education for Peace and Sustainable Development. Quite a mouthful. And it's all about putting SEL in all the schools and transforming education around the world. It's a truly subversive institute, and all you really need to know is who's running it, right? This is the lady who created it. Her name is Irina Bokova. She was the foreign minister of the mass-murdering communist dictatorship that slaughtered about 250,000 Bulgarians. Sounds like a good person to put in charge of the UN's education agency. Then you have this lady here, Rosa Utanbayeva. She was the president of the Soviet Kyrgyz Republic, another mass-murdering communist dictatorship. And then last but not least, you have Dr. Karan Singh. Interesting guy. He's the co-founder and the co-chair of the World Commission on Global Consciousness and Spirituality, along with Robert Mueller. We'll come to him later. And he was also the Minister of Family Planning in India under Indira Gandhi. I don't know if any of you guys remember that whole thing, but they rounded up millions and millions of poor Indians, loaded them onto trucks, and forcibly sterilized them, killing huge numbers of people. Sterilized millions of people more than Adolf Hitler and his Nazis. So that's who they thought should be running this institute that's going to get SEL in not just every American school, but every school in the world. In the interest of time, we're going to skip some of these crazy videos that they put out, but they are monstrous, and they give you some insight into SEL. But I want to show you how this kind of works, right? Because they've been doing it for a long time, changing the attitudes and values of children. So back in the early 1990s, if I had told you that within a generation Americans would be celebrating so-called homosexual marriage, you would have laughed at me. You might have called the guys with the white coats and the rubber room and locked me away. Homosexual marriage? Don't be silly. Sodomy is still a crime across most of the United States. I mean, that's ridiculous. That's never going to happen. Well, they were using the social change function of school. They were anticipating what we would need, and they were socially changing our children to prepare for that new reality. So they got a documentary. It's called It's Elementary, talking about gay issues at school. And I want to show you a little clip from that documentary. They showed this all across the United States in public schools, first grade, second grade, third grade. They all had to sit there and watch it. Here's a little clip.
Let me tell you quickly the background. Today, the law says that if you're the same sex, 2 men and 2 women, you can't get married. It is against the law. And I thought that it might be kind of fun for us to sort of be pretend judges for a few minutes. What I'm going to give each of you is a sheet that just tells you that some people think that it's wrong for gays to get married, that it's not natural, and that it goes against what a family is.
Those are the bad
people
people,
think
obviously.
that the state should not decide these things, that it should just be up to 2 adults to decide what they want to do. What do you think the answer to these questions are? Should
See, and now all the kids come to their own conclusion. What if they had told these kids the truth? What if they had told these kids that God says marriage is a representation of the relationship between Christ and the church? What if they had told them that marriage was God's design for humanity to bring more people into the world, to glorify his name? Maybe they wouldn't have come to this silly conclusion, right? But we're pretend judges. And what happened? 20 years later, the pretend judges on our U.S. Supreme Court struck down marriage laws in all 50 states and gave us a so-called right to a so-called homosexual marriage. So they're very good at this. They're very good at this. And they're doing this on 100 different issues right now that we won't have time to go through. Now, here we are today. This is what they call the Drag Queen Story Hour. They bring a guy in wearing some demon horns and a dress, reading LGBT stories to your children. Minnesota took a boy who somehow got duped into believing he was a girl. They chopped off his private parts, called it a gender transition, against the wishes of his mom, by the way. Federal courts weighed in, said that was not a violation of her parental rights. California, they've got a transition plan right on the Department of Education website. So when a kid wakes up after being brainwashed for 2 years and says, I think I'm a girl, say, oh good, here's your gender transition form. What name do you want to be called? What are your pronouns? Do your parents know? Because don't worry, we'll hide it from them if they don't. I thought, man, California, that's a nutty place. I mean, I know even when they asked them to vote on homosexual marriage, they voted no, but you know, it's getting really crazy. But come to find out, this same exact document is being used all over the country. I was teaching on education in a very conservative rural district in Florida. And one of the school board members came up to me after my talk and said, Alex, that exact same form is here in Flagler County. Okay, this is ubiquitous. It's everywhere. They're doing drag shows in school. I won't even show you, it's so nasty. The NEA, largest union in America, 3.1 million members, teachers. They sent this out to all their members about how to make an inclusive brainwash school.
Hi, your name is Emma, correct? And my name is Zine. What pronouns do you use?
I use she, they, them.
Cool.
What pronouns do you use?
I use they, them, and also just Z. And so instead of being a boy or a girl or something undefined or in the middle, I kind of like, just use my name. You know, my name is Zine. So if you just use Z instead of a pronoun, it's like more personalized and like less fitting into a binary.
Yeah. Okay, so my pronouns for future reference, generalissimo and your eminence. Don't you dare misgender me, we'll have a big problem. Now, a lot of people, when I go to like the conservative states, say, oh, that's just those crazy people in New York and California and Illinois, right? That doesn't apply in South Carolina, Oklahoma. Well, actually it does. One of the most conservative states in the country, politically speaking, is the state of Utah. Supermajority Republican House, supermajority Republican Senate. Every statewide office is held by a Republican. Every county except one is entirely controlled by Republicans. You think they'll be the last place this stuff gets to. Well, I was there in 2020, right as government was shutting everything down in response to COVID. And some of the members of the state school board gave me this data. This came from the medical prescription database, the drugs that were being prescribed. There was a 10,000% increase over 5 years, from 2015 to 2020, in the number of underage girls going through gender transitions. They were giving them testosterone injections, preparing them for double mastectomies, hysterectomies, etc., puberty blockers. A 10,000% increase in 5 years. Now let's ask ourselves, is it something in the water? Or are they brainwashing the kids? Obviously they're brainwashing the kids. Okay, it's very, very simple. Here's the graph. 10,000% increase there. Now, you've got surveys. This one came out a couple years ago. Less than half of teens identify as straight, as heterosexual. Okay. And if you thought this was the last stop on the crazy train, you have not been paying attention, right? You just add P to the end of the alphabet, mafia letter thing, and you get a good sense of where they're going. Now, without getting too much into the graphic details, 2016, California passed a law saying all the kids had to be brainwashed with LGBT history. And so we got some of the curriculum. Moms and school board members were sending it to me. They start off with Harvey Milk, the pervert child rapist, some of whose victims killed themselves. Oh, what a hero! He launched the LGBT revolution in America. And then they get down to the ancient Greeks and they just kind of casually throw out there that pedophilia was rampant and no big deal. And so this mom goes to confront the assistant superintendent of curricula for the school district and says, what are you teaching my kids? Why are you normalizing pedophilia? Listen to what the assistant superintendent for curricula says.
Answer why you're teaching pedophilia in school at tonight's readings. Teaching what? Pedophilia. Pederosity right here.
It's just a different sexual orientation. Okay, don't be such a prude. And guess what? It's now against the fake law, thanks to the U.S. Supreme Court, the pretend judges there, to discriminate against someone based on their so-called sexual orientation. So what happens when these kids being brainwashed in California grow up? You can't discriminate against that minor attracted person. That's hate speech. Of course he can run your kindergarten. You don't want to go to jail, do you? It's just a different sexual orientation. You see where this is going? And you see how quickly it's happening? That social change function of schools. So a lot of this originates with the UN. The UN has global sex education standards that are so wicked, so abominable, I can't even tell you what they want to teach 5-year-olds. I wouldn't share these things with my worst enemy's children. They're that monstrous. I cannot even tell you the things that they want to teach them. They're so bad. And it all goes back to this monster here in human form, Alfred Kinsey. He's the guy who did a bunch of fake research funded by the Rockefellers, funded by the taxpayers, funded by the CIA, and concluded, without getting into all the gory details, they had abused and raped a bunch of little kids, babies. They concluded that the babies enjoyed it, and therefore we have to brainwash all the kids with sex education the moment we can pry them loose from their families. So what are they actually doing in school? Well, they are learning religious stuff. They're going on field trips to mosques. You got the 5 pillars of Islam on the school board. You got Buddhism in the classroom. We're doing yoga, Hindu rituals in the classroom. We're learning to summon spirits, right? You got a Black Lives Matter teacher training program, teaching teachers how to teach students how to summon spirits.
Then I'm going to ask you to hold an ancestor in your head right now. Ancestors watching, I know they're watching. Ancestors watching, I know. Now call out your ancestors into the room.
They're not your ancestors. Bad idea. Okay. Exactly. We're summoning demons into the classroom. Now in North Carolina, they actually got caught forcing the Christian children to stand up in front of the classroom during a struggle session and repent of their Christian privilege. I'm so sorry that I was born a Christian. My parents tell me I'm a Christian. I'm sorry, please forgive me for oppressing you. Okay. What kid wants to be subjected to that? Right?
Christian privilege?
Yeah, Christian privilege. Hey, we all have Christian privilege, apparently. That's what they're teaching kids. Now in California, this has just kind of blossomed to full fruition. In 2021, the State Education Board, if you can call it education, approved unanimously a new ethnic studies model curriculum. And as part of this curriculum, elementary school children were supposed to chant to the pagan demonic deities of the Aztec Empire, the deities of cannibalism and war and human sacrifice. Don't you dare read your Bible. Don't you dare mention the 10 Commandments. But yes, we're going to be chanting to the demon gods of cannibalism. Okay? The ones that demanded mass human sacrifice, the ripping out of human hearts on top of pyramids. That's fine. Just don't mention the 10 Commandments. Okay? So the technology that they're using now to gather data on these kids, it's actually a big part of the brainwashing process. They call it individual learning. So they give your kid a device, and then you get ideas like open borders, abortion, Aztec deities. And they have a facial expression camera that they started deploying in 2012 through federally funded education programs that will monitor the expression that your child makes when exposed to different stimuli. And if you see a homosexual couple kissing, or you see a baby being aborted, this one needs an intervention. He's got the wrong attitudes, the wrong beliefs. He's not compassionate. He's not empathetic. We need to stage an intervention. They actually brag that they're going to use all this data to predict your children's future behavior and performance. This is right in the U.S. Department of Education's reports. Now, you've probably heard of Common Core. The government knows it's making your kids dumber and dumber and dumber. They funded a very expensive study. The same people who brought you Common Core brought you the next generation pseudoscience standards. 18 years of so-called science, not once will you hear the term scientific method. Why? Because then you wouldn't believe any of the other garbage they're teaching you. You'd know it wasn't science. The global warming, the evolution, the gendered silliness, right? You'd know that that wasn't science. So you can't learn the scientific method in science class. You have to learn pseudoscience. Totally fake history, right? Absolutely fake history. But at least they're learning how to read, write, and do math. No, they're not. Okay? And that's not my opinion. The federal government, every 2 years, they do what they call the National Assessment of Educational Progress. They take a representative sample of victims of the brainwash camps, and they give them an academic test, find out what they know about math, English, etc. What they found is that less than 1/3 of these victims are proficient in anything. Okay, here's the Deputy Secretary of Education.
The National Assessment of Educational Progress, the NAEP, which is called America's Report Card, reports that 2/3, get this, 2/3 of American 8th graders are not proficient in any core subject.
You imagine that in any other industry, right? Like imagine a fast food restaurant where less than 1/3 of the people who went in and bought a cheeseburger got a cheeseburger. Most of the customers got a decomposing rodent or a plate full of cockroaches. And then imagine they said, just give us more money. Right? We would send in the SWAT team and have them all hauled off to jail. And yet when they do it with the minds and the hearts and the souls of our children, we say, oh yes, master, here, have more money. Oh, you need them for 14 hours a day? Okay, yes, master. It's obscene. And we wouldn't tolerate it for one instance in any other industry. Right? Now, back before I was born, Ronald Reagan warned about this. He put together a commission. They said the very foundations of our society, our future as a nation and as a people, is under threat as a result of this so-called education system. They said if a foreign power had imposed it on us, we would have viewed it as an act of war. And we should view it as an act of war. It was. If you go back to early America, what you will find is Americans were unbelievably well educated. I mean, you can't even make a comparison. It's like apples and airplanes. I mean, they were so far ahead of us, you can't even begin to imagine. Go read the Federalist Papers, written to average, everyday people, farmers, shopkeepers, blacksmiths. Go read those, and then go find a college graduate who can understand them today. We've got the literacy data for early America. Almost everybody could read. DuPont de Nemours did a comprehensive study on the education in the United States, 1812, said not more than 4 in 1,000 young Americans are unable to write legibly, even neatly. Today is exactly the opposite, right? You find 4 in 1,000 young people who can write legibly and neatly. That is an achievement. We'll give that school district a big award, right? Have a big party. Here's the presidential speeches by length and complexity, grade level. Here's 1800. There's 2000. You get to 2024, you have Kamala Harris of Russia big and Ukraine small. We're worse than kindergartners now. So, and this is how Americans used to be educated, right? We didn't have $1 trillion a year so-called government education system. We didn't have a government education system at all. Parents educated their children using little tools like this, the New England Primer, hundreds of years, bestseller. This is how kids learned how to read. They learned their letters, their ABCs. A, in Adam's fall, we sinned all. Okay. So they learned their theology with their letters. And they could read. The very first education law ever passed in these colonies, the Old Deluder Satan Act. What'd they say? One of the chief projects of that old deluder Satan is to keep men from knowledge of the scriptures. Now you know why our young people can't read. Alexis de Tocqueville came over here from France in the 1830s and was astounded. This is what he said. Every citizen gets the elementary notions of human knowledge. He's taught the doctrines and evidences of his religion, the history of his country, the leading features of its constitution. It's extremely rare to find a man imperfectly acquainted with all these things. Somebody wholly ignorant of them is a sort of phenomenon. Exactly the opposite today, right? You find somebody who is even remotely acquainted with these things. You say, oh, you must be homeschooled. So by 1776, every major Christian denomination in America was operating its own school system. Alexis de Tocqueville actually says every child is primarily educated by the family, and to the extent that outside influences participate, it's all the Protestant clergy. Okay? And then along came this guy, Robert Owen, a communist long before Karl Marx hit the scene with the Communist Manifesto, wanted to abolish private property, get rid of the family, believed so passionately in these ideas that he set up a commune in Indiana called New Harmony, wrote a bunch of crazy essays saying that the government ought to educate people's children. And people said, no, that's insane. Chapter and verse, please. The Bible was still the primary book in education all across the United States at that time. Some people said, no, that's ridiculous. Well, these essays were picked up by the Prussian ambassador, Baron Jacobi, taken back to the Prussian dictator, who, according to Robert Owen's autobiography, so much approved of this idea that he ordered his interior minister to set up the first ever government school system of the state, by the state, and for the state. Robert Owen also set up a secret society, we know because of a whistleblower who defected and exposed what they were doing. He said it was modeled on the Carbonari of Europe, and he said the great object was to get rid of Christianity. And their strategy was to have the government educate people's children. That was the goal of their mission to have the government take over education was to get rid of Christianity, according to this whistleblower, Orestes Brownson. So Horace Mann comes along. He's very well known as one of the founding fathers of America's government school system, Massachusetts. He re-imported the Prussian system. He actually went to Prussia, studied the system, brought it back to Massachusetts, and then went to New York, went to Connecticut, like a traveling evangelist, preaching the good news of salvation by government schools. And little by little, dummies in the legislature said, okay, we'll try it out. And to be clear, it didn't look like it looks today. The Bible was still the main textbook. The kids might come together for a month or two when they weren't helping the parents on the farm. It wasn't anything like what we have today. But little by little, government schools were being established across the country. And by the end of World War I, most American children found themselves in a government brainwash camp for many months out of the year. The turning point in human history. Now, he wanted to get the Bible out, Horace Mann did. He didn't say that too openly, but he did write it down. Obviously, that was not a popular idea at the time. We were still a thoroughly Christian society. He brought in a new method of teaching reading that we won't have time to get to today, the whole word method. And within 2 years, all the schoolmasters wrote an essay saying, hey, this is really dumb. We're not going to use it. Kids can't learn how to read this way. So it was resurrected 50 years later by John Dewey, the other founding father of America's government school system. He went to the Soviet Union for his inspiration rather than Prussia, teamed up with the Rockefellers, and started a foundation called, it's kind of like a bad joke, right? A communist and a super capitalist walk into a bar, and they decide to set up a government school system to dumb down all your kids. Okay. Now, they had different ideas for the world, but they had a convergence of interest. They all knew that they needed dumbed down children separated from the Bible if their vision for the future was going to succeed. You could not rule over Americans with tyranny if Americans were well educated and well versed in the scriptures. So that's what they started. An unbelievable story there. We've got the story of it in a book I have in the back, Crimes of the Educators. They resurrected the whole word method of teaching reading, as I mentioned. And you wonder, how do they teach reading today? Well, in Common Core, children need to memorize high-frequency words. That's a direct quote from the standards in Common Core. This is what it looks like. And you wonder why 90 million U.S. adults by the year 1990 were functionally illiterate, according to the federal government's own study. Half of our adult population functionally illiterate. It's by design, folks. They did it on purpose. Now, I want to share with you a little bit about John Dewey's religion. John Dewey was a religious man. He and his buddies started a new religion, or what they thought was a new religion. They called it humanism. They wrote the Humanist Manifesto. And they said that religious humanists regard the universe as self-existing and not created. Well, the Bible says, in the beginning, God created. These are fundamentally incompatible. Right? Our founding fathers said our Creator endowed us with certain unalienable rights. So John Dewey's false religion is not compatible with the scriptures, obviously. It's not compatible with the ideas that our country is based on. So what were they going to do? Well, one of the co-signers of the Humanist Manifesto, C.F. Potter, wrote in a book, Humanism, a New Religion, education is going to be the most powerful ally of humanism. What's your Sunday school going to do 1 hour a week with only some of the kids against 5 days of humanistic teachings? And of course the answer was, not much. Okay. Now let's think about this humanism a little more. Right? There is no real God. So I'm a God, you're a God. There are no real rules because there is no God to give rules, so I'll determine what's right. You determine what's right for you. This should start sounding kind of familiar. Genesis chapter 3, it's Satan speaking, ye shall be as gods. Does this stuff sound familiar? It is literally a repackaged version of the oldest lie in the book that unfortunately has now been taught to at least 3 generations of Americans. In 1962, the Supreme Court banned prayer in our schools. It was actually a case involving New York. 1963, they banned the Bible in school. Now, the justice who wrote the dissent in this case had a brilliant dissent. He said this refusal to permit religious exercises is not the realization of state neutrality, but rather the establishment of a religion of secularism, or as John Dewey would have said, humanism. So under the guise of neutrality, they established a false religion from hell. They taught it to our children, and they forced us to pay for its propagation with our tax money. And we wonder why kids don't know which bathroom to go into. We wonder why kids come and shoot up the school. We wonder why they're aborting their babies and taking heroin. It's because they've been brainwashed with a false religion. So now they want this on a global scale. I mentioned the UN's education agency, UNESCO. The first head is right here, Julian Huxley. Funny story, he was the first president of the British Humanist Association. He was also the president of the British Eugenics Society, these wackadoodles who thought some races are better than other races, and if we breed people like cows, we'll have a better race, kind of like Hitler ideas, right? There's one of their propaganda posters. So that's the guy they put in charge of the Global Education Initiative. And they've told us over and over again, all human beings need to learn from the same learning standards. Education is a common and universal responsibility, which means it's a UN responsibility. And all kids need the same standards. They said governments must change the attitudes, values, and practices of children. These are all in official, ratified UN agreements on education. 2016, they came up with a global action plan on education when the UN met in Korea, and they said it has to advance spirituality as well. Now, our country is very deeply involved in this.
To be here today with you this morning to
Arnie Duncan.
UNESCO. During the last 65 years, UNESCO.
So here he is at UNESCO, bragging that they're his global partner. He says education is the most powerful weapon you can use to change the world.
Hi, I'm Arnie Duncan, U.S. Secretary of Education, and we are so honored that the UN Secretary General has designated the United States as a champion country of the UN Global Education First Initiative.
So we're not just participating, we're a champion country of this global education madness. That's what our Secretary of Education said, okay? It's not Alex Newman telling you that. So the UN developed what they call the World Core Curriculum. The guy who wrote it, Robert Mueller, Assistant Secretary General of the UN, he's called the father of global education, had a lot to say. He thought the UN was the body of Christ. Those are his words. Okay. Now, this World Core Curriculum, he wrote a teacher's manual for it, and in the foreword to the teacher's manual, he says something really interesting. He says that the underlying philosophy upon which it's based is going to be found in the books of Alice Bailey by the Tibetan teacher Javal Kool. And some of you are probably wondering, who is Alice Bailey? Who is the Tibetan teacher? Well, I'll give you a hint. Alice Bailey was the founder of the Lucifer Publishing Company. True story. Still around today. It's called the Lucis Trust. They rebranded because Lucifer Publishing is just a little too obvious. But they still believe the same stuff. They think Lucifer was the good guy, and they'll tell anybody who will listen. And the Tibetan teacher was not a Tibetan or a teacher, or even a human being. Alice Bailey claimed to be communicating with, you guessed it, ascended masters. And I've got a bunch of her crazy books for research purposes in my office. One of them, and if the global education standards are based on the writings of Alice Bailey, we ought to know what she said. Well, in her book, Education and the New Age, she says world citizenship should be the goal of the enlightened, with a world federation, which is world government, and a world brain, which, by the way, this was written 50 years before personal computers, internet, Google, etc. She says we need to fuse Marxism and neo-scholasticism. We're going to do this using the freely chosen cooperative methods of John Dewey. Isn't that amazing? Full circle. So now, here's the Secretary General of the UN in 2016 after that conference telling you the purpose of education.
Education must do more than produce individuals who can read, write, and count. It must nurture global citizens who can rise to the challenges of the 21st century.
You see how this works? You see why they're brainwashing kids to hate their country and hate their family and hate God? They're building, or trying to build, a satanic global economic, political, and religious system. And they're doing it right in front of our faces. They're not even hiding it. They're writing it down in books. They're giving speeches about it. They're issuing press releases about it. It's just your local fake media is not going to connect the dots for you. So Bill Gates of hell, very prominent individual, you probably know him, he's the guy behind Common Core, right? So he goes over to UNESCO headquarters in 2004 and signs an agreement with UNESCO. They agree that they're going to create global standards, global curricula, global teacher training programs, and global technology to make it all work.
Up until now?
Then he comes back and he puts millions, and then ultimately $2.3 billion into that atrocity that we call today Common Core. And they bought advertisements to tell you how great Common Core was going to be. Here's one of the ads they bought to persuade you that Common Core was a good thing. Listen to what they say.
Up until now, it's been pretty hard to tell how well kids are competing in school and how well they're going to do when they get out of school. Is a girl in your neighborhood being taught as much as her friend over in the next one? Is a graduating senior in, say, St. Louis as prepared to get a job as the graduate in Shanghai? Well, it turns out the answer to both of these questions is no. Because for years, states have been setting different standards for what students should know and be able to do at each grade level. What we really need are clear goals. That's where the Common Core state standards come in. The standards are consistent from school to school, and they match up against international standards too.
They match up against international standards too. That's them bragging that Common Core matches up with the international standards, right? That's not me telling you, that's their ad bragging that Common Core aligns America's so-called education system with the world system that they are building. And it does, in every possible way. So in the last 8 minutes that I have, I wanted to share with you some thoughts on how we deal with this as the people of God. And I have my own opinions, and you can throw those right out the window. Right? They're just as good as your opinions. And then I'm going to share with you what the scriptures say, which that you better not throw out the window. So the first obvious question is, well, can we reform this abomination? And I would submit to you that the answer is very plainly no. It was designed to do what it's doing. When you understand that it's not broken, it's working very well, then suddenly you realize, oh, how do you fix something that's working very well? Right? You take your car into the mechanic and it's running perfect and you say, fix it, he'll say, what? It's doing what it was designed to do. It's brainwashing your kids to turn against God, against their family, against their country, and to make them illiterates. It's working very well. And they brag, right? They laugh at the laws we passed. I'm not going to show you because we don't have time, but the president of the School Counselors Association on camera laughing at my state of Florida because we passed the Stop Woke Act where you can't brainwash kids under 4th grade with LGBT stuff. By the way, they surrendered on that. You can now brainwash kids under 4th grade with LGBT stuff. It was an out-of-court settlement. But Congressman Massey talked about shut down the Department of Education. But as I see it, we really have two options left. We either prepare for this one-world totalitarian system and keep feeding our children to it, or we pull our children out as quickly as we possibly can. I tell people that you need to think of the school system as a burning building, okay? And your children are in the burning building, and you feel the flames, you hear the screaming, and I know a lot of us like, oh, I don't hear any screaming. What screaming are you talking about? Everything's fine, but we all hear it. Let's not pretend that we don't. And so what do we do if the kids are trapped in a burning building? And if you said run for school board, you probably don't have kids. Okay? And I'm not against running for school board. Running for school board is good and it's important, but if you have children in the system, you don't run for school board. You don't petition your state legislature. The building's on fire. You run in there and you grab your children and you run as fast as your legs will carry you to safety. And then you wake the town and you say, guys, your children are burning. And frankly, the burning building is a terrible analogy because a burning building is only going to hurt them physically. It might even kill them, right? But we know there are things much worse than death. Here we're talking about a system that's destroying them not just physically, but mentally, academically, spiritually, morally, ethically, in every possible way. These kids are being utterly destroyed. And if you don't believe me, go down and look at some of the young people. Go ask them some questions. Okay. So, we have got to get these kids out, and we need the churches to participate. We've got buildings all over this country sitting empty 5 or 6 days a week. Why? We could have Christian children in there getting a real education. Okay. Now we get to the scriptures, right? We need to actually ask ourselves some really fundamental questions about education, like who should be in charge? What is it about? What's it for? What's the purpose? So let's go to the Word of God. Proverbs 22:6, the Bible tells us that Caesar needs to be training up all those children in the way that they should. Thank you. At least some people are like, no. No. This is not a job for Caesar. Okay? The Bible makes that very, very clear. Deuteronomy chapter 11 and also Deuteronomy chapter 6 give us a real insight into what real education looks like. Right? God said that you should be teaching your children about Him and His laws and what He has done for us when you wake up in the morning, when you're sitting in your house, when you're walking by the way, when you lie down at night, when you rise up in the morning. In other words, all the time. There's no time to give them to Caesar to learn LGBT stuff and climate change. This is your job. Ephesians 6:4 is actually my kid's favorite Bible verse. It gets quoted every day in my house. Papa, you're provoking us to anger. Fathers, don't provoke your children to anger, but what? Bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. That's our job. That's not Caesar's job. That's not your local school board's job. That's our job. And if you think you can do that 30 minutes a day after the government gets done with them for 8 hours a day, you're kidding yourself. 90% of Christian children who spent 12 years in a brainwash camp are going to leave the faith, they're going to reject the Bible, they're going to leave the church. And they're getting better and better, so coming soon it'll be more than that. And now they want to control our private schools too. Proverbs 9:10 tells us that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Proverbs 1:7 tells us the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. How much fear of the Lord is being instilled in our children in the government's brainwash camps? Zero. And so anybody who thinks their children are going to get wisdom or knowledge is absolutely kidding themselves. Right? Not even the slightest bit. At best, it's counterfeit wisdom, counterfeit knowledge from the pit of hell. And so what happens with no knowledge? Well, my people are destroyed for a lack of knowledge. That's us. The church in America today. We are on the verge of being destroyed if we don't get it. Now we know the gates of hell will never prevail against the church of Jesus Christ. But God commanded us clearly how we are to raise and disciple his children. Okay, now Jesus says something really interesting, and he's talking about taxes in Mark 12. He says to them, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. So how do we know that the coin goes to Caesar? It's got Caesar's image on it. That's what Jesus said. Right? Whose image is on your children? So should we be handing our children over to Caesar? No. Absolutely, positively not. Right? We don't even own our children. They're just a temporary responsibility that God has blessed us with. And we would better follow his instructions or we will reap the whirlwind. And again, we come back to Jesus. Whoever's not with me is against me. I always give an opportunity. Who wants to say that public schools are with Christ? Always the same answer. The pagans know, the godless know. It's only the Christians who haven't put this into their mind yet. Right? If the schools are not with Christ, oh, yeah. It doesn't take formal training in logic to figure that out. Why would we as Christians send our children to a system that we know is against our Lord and our Savior and our King? And you know, some of us did it out of ignorance. I'm not here speaking out of a place of judgment. I got my own problems with my own kids, and I think we all do, right? Especially in today's world. But this is really, really critical for the church to understand. And I think it's probably one of the main reasons that our country and our churches and our families are crumbling before our eyes. Because we've been doing this for 5 generations now. It is a catastrophe. So, wow, I'm just about out of time, so I'll just rush right to the end here. I would encourage you very highly to consider home education for your children. All these men here were primarily educated at home by their parents and their families, built the greatest, freest country in the history of the world. Homeschoolers are running circles around the victims of government schools. Got lots of resources here if you're interested. I'm a senior fellow for Classical Conversations. It's a great homeschool program. My kids are signed up in there. I'm also on the board of the Freedom Project Academy. It's a K-12 Christian school. We can partner with your church or whatever if you're interested. I serve as the executive director for Public School Exit. It's a volunteer position, even though it's a fancy title. Our goal is to get parents and pastors to understand that we must remove our children from this system, and we will do anything possible, even find money if people are not doing it because of money issues. Here's my latest book right here, Indoctrinating Our Children to Death. I've got a handful of copies over there. The whole history of how we got here, where it's going, what the Bible teaches on these things, what our education system used to look like, and just a couple more thoughts here. You know, we've got our AR-15s, or maybe not in New York, but in Florida, we've got our AR-15s, and we're going to defend our freedom. Right? Well, guess what? They don't even need your guns, folks. They have your kids. What are you going to do with your guns when your kids show up on your front porch to confiscate them? Nothing, right? This is ultimately a spiritual battle, as we'll get to. So we need an exodus from the government schools. Our founders risked their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor so that we could live in freedom today. We don't have to do that yet, thankfully, but if we don't get serious, a day will come. Now, if you want to get my free newsletter, libertysentinel.org/subscribe. Comes out twice a week, all different stuff, not just education, but a lot of different stuff. And I'll leave you with this, ladies and gentlemen. This is not actually an educational battle. It's not a political battle. It's not an economic battle. It is, at its core, a spiritual battle. And the Apostle Paul teaches this very clearly in Ephesians chapter 6. He tells us that we're not battling against flesh and blood. It's not Joe Biden and the education secretary and Hillary Clinton or whatever. That's not ultimately the problem. We're up against not flesh and blood, but principalities, powers, the rulers of the darkness of this world and spiritual wickedness in high places. Another way of saying this, Satan wants your kids, and his minions want your kids. And God has placed you in a position of authority and responsibility to protect them. Right? We know Satan goes about like a lion, seeking whom he may devour. Anybody ever seen a lion in Africa? You ever seen them hunt? They come to a pack of wildebeests. Do they go for the big, strong wildebeest? They go for the babies, right? Satan and his minions are coming after your kids, folks. So we have to take this seriously. It's not an option anymore. We must take this seriously. And I do believe that if Christians would do the right thing and ensure that their children get a God-honoring, Bible-centered education, we could have an incredible revival in the church. We could see our nation restored. We could see our families restored. But it's gonna take work. With God's help, we can do it. Thank you guys, and God bless you.